Women in the Tudor Court disappeared long before they died. Their names slipped from the page, their voices buried beneath ceremonies that praised everyone except them. What remained were shadows moving through corridors, carrying truths no chronicle dared to keep. Some lived entire lives in moments no one noticed, leaving traces only the night could hold. Tonight, you will walk beside them through the hours history chose to forget. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to slip quietly into the Tudor palace after the last torch dimmed, the world that history forgot would begin to unfold in the hush that followed. The corridors emptied of officials and ceremony would feel strangely alive, as though the silence itself carried the weight of stories no scribe ever wrote down. Within those stone walls, the women of the court, so often displayed in daylight as ornaments of rank and order, existed in a very different form once the rituals ended. Their lives, hidden behind heavy doors, were not shaped by proclamations or pageantry, but by the quiet hours when no one demanded a bow, a smile, or a perfect stillness. In these moments, the air seemed to thicken with what they could not say aloud. A lady in waiting might sit on the edge of a narrow bed, her fingers trembling as she loosened the stiff laces that had held her upright through a long day of watching, serving, and pretending. Her hairpins clinked softly onto the wooden table, small metallic sighs of relief that marked the first seconds she was allowed to feel like a person rather than a symbol. The shadows on the walls danced faintly, stirred by a dying candle, and for the first time since dawn, her posture softened. No one in the palace would record the way her shoulders finally dropped, or how her breath slowed as she let the silence wrap around her like a blanket. Across the palace, another woman, perhaps one whose name appeared in official documents, might press her forehead gently to the cold stone beside a shuttered window. The darkness outside offered no comfort, yet it felt more honest than the day's ceremonies. There, she could allow herself a moment of exhaustion that daylight never permitted. The polished grace she displayed at court hid the ache in her back, the tightness in her jaw, the sorrow that she swallowed every time someone addressed her, not as a person, but as a title. In these hours, stripped of audience and expectation, she saw her reflection not in gilded mirrors, but in the faint glimmer of the window pane. Blurred, tired, real. For many of the younger women, the quiet was unnerving rather than soothing. They had been trained to move gracefully, to speak softly, to serve without question, but not to think too deeply. When the palace fell silent, and their minds were no longer occupied by duties, thoughts crept into the gaps like cold air through cracks in the wall. Some wondered if their families missed them. Others wondered whether the court would ever regard them as more than replaceable fixtures. A few feared the dawn, knowing it would drag them back into the rigid choreography of the next day. What the history books praise as order and magnificence was, in truth, maintained by women holding their breath. During the day, every gesture had to be calculated. A misplaced smile, a step too slow, an expression too earnest. Any of these could spiral into rumor. But at night, when the weight of watching eyes finally lifted, they sat barefoot on cold floors, or leaned against bedposts, or stared at the flickering flame of a candle that burned lower each hour. They were alone with their thoughts, and those thoughts were heavy. It is strange to imagine how ordinary their humanity was beneath the heavy costumes of duty. A queen might quietly rub her temples, trying to ease the tension of a headache she could not acknowledge. A noble woman might adjust her bruised ribs, hidden beneath layers of fabric tightened earlier by attendants who had no choice but to obey. A maidservant might cry silently into her sleeves, careful not to let the sound carry through the thin wood of the door. These were moments of truth, fragile, unguarded, and absent from the royal records. Even the palace itself behaved differently at night. The polished floors, shining with reflections during the day, turned uneven and shadowed. The tapestries that impressed foreign visitors seemed darker, heavier, almost watchful, and the distant echoes, footsteps, a cough, the quiet thud of a door closing, felt like reminders that the women who lived here did not belong to themselves. Everything surrounding them reinforced the same fact. Their identities were bound to a throne they could never sit on. Looking back from the present, it feels unsettling to consider how many of their emotions dissolved into these nighttime hours like breath fading into cold air. Their joy, when it came, was small and quickly hidden. Their fear was constant but contained. Their longing, whether for freedom, affection, or the simple comfort of being truly seen, remained unspoken. And in this quiet, the court became a place not of power, but of containment. What survived in official accounts were the grand events, the alliances, the scandals, but not the trembling hands, the whispered prayers, the moments when a woman sat alone and wondered how much of herself she was allowed to keep. The palace by day belonged to the king and council, but the palace by night belonged to them. And it was in these forgotten hours that the true lives of Tudor women unfolded, private, fragile, and carved into silence. They were remembered for their titles, their marriages, their roles in succession, but never for these moments when the world stopped demanding and started revealing. The darkness did not free them, but it exposed the truth, that beneath the shimmering surface of court life lay a quiet ache no chronicle cared to mention. Yet it was this ache that shaped them more than any ceremony. The quiet that surrounded them was heavier than any crown. Yet it held the only honesty they ever knew. In that stillness, another layer of their world waits, one shaped by the weight of unspoken hours. And within that hush lies a truth that moves unseen through the corridors, waiting for the light to reveal what the darkness has guarded. The palace always felt heavier once the rituals ended, as though the walls themselves exhaled after a day spent holding the weight of ceremony. In those hours, the women who had moved like polished ornaments before the court were finally allowed to exist without an audience. Their rooms, dimly lit by the last surviving candles, became the only spaces where they could loosen the stiffness that duty carved into their bodies. The silence was not comforting, but it was honest. It showed them exactly how tired they were. Some sat on the edge of their beds, fingers numb from the cold that seeped through stone floors, undoing layers of fabric that had pressed into their ribs since dawn. Each knot untied felt like peeling away a version of themselves they had worn only for the sake of appearances. Their skin bore faint marks from tightly laced bodices, small red lines that would never appear in portraits, yet defined their daily lives far more than any painted smile. A few women stared at their own hands for a long time, as if trying to remember when those hands had last belonged to someone free. Others remained standing, too restless to sit. They paced short distances across cramped chambers, their footsteps barely audible over the soft crackle of a waning candle. In daylight, they walked with measured grace, every step rehearsed. At night, their movements lost that precision. Shoulders slumped, chins lowered. Their bodies behaved like bodies again, not symbols in motion. The lack of restraint felt almost frightening. Some women cried, though never loudly. Tears were not a rarity here. They simply had no place in the daylight hours where courtly perfection mattered more than human feeling. A queen might press her sleeve to her mouth to quiet a sob. A lady in waiting might turn her back to the room so no one, if anyone was nearby, could see her trembling. Grief was private, and privacy was scarce. Memory lingered in these quiet hours, like a faint draught slipping beneath a door. Thoughts of home drifted in, a mother's touch, a sibling's laughter, fields that looked nothing like the rigid lines of palace gardens. For women taken from distant regions or foreign courts, the longing was sharper. They were allowed to send letters, but not always allowed to feel what those letters stirred inside them. At night, the ache returned unhindered. What struck hardest was how little space existed between sorrow and duty, even when alone. Many women rehearsed the next day's expressions, the respectful tilt of the head, the restrained smile, the careful stillness of the eyes. Court life demanded that their emotions be curated like tapestries, ornamental, from afar, unreadable up close. Training had turned them into creatures of composure. Yet the hours after the ceremony reminded them of the self buried beneath that training. Occasionally, faint sounds seeped through the corridors, the muffled steps of servants finishing late tasks, the distant clatter of trays, the low wind brushing past arrow-slit windows. These noises emphasized the isolation more than they disturbed it. The palace, proud and imposing by day, became an architecture of loneliness at night. Looking at this from the present, it is difficult not to feel unsettled by the quiet suffering woven into such an opulent world. Modern imaginations often picture courts as glittering realms of influence and romance. Yet the truth rested in these unrecorded hours, when a woman sat alone with thoughts she was never allowed to voice. If someone today paced a narrow apartment after work, overwhelmed by exhaustion, but forced to appear composed by morning, the feeling might come close. Though Tudor silence pressed heavier than anything we know now. The contrast was striking. Grand rooms filled with power by day became chambers of fragility by night. And inside those chambers, each woman confronted the life she had been assigned rather than chosen. The palace did not care whether they were lonely, but their loneliness shaped them far more deeply than their duties ever did. The hush that settled over their chambers revealed truths that daylight concealed. In that dim stillness, another set of moments waits where unspoken emotions gather like shadows pooling at the edge of the room. And somewhere within that quiet, a presence lingers that hints at what the next unseen hour might hold. The hours before dawn in the Tudor palace carried a kind of darkness that felt heavier than night itself. The corridors were still, the air unmoving, and the faint grey light that seeped through the narrow windows revealed nothing clearly. Only shapes, only outlines, only the suggestion of another long day approaching. Within these muted moments, women woke not to restlessness, but to obligation. Their bodies rose before their minds fully returned to them, guided by habit rather than choice. In these rooms, the cold was the first thing to touch them. Stone walls held the night like a memory, and every surface, even cloth, felt laced with chill. A lady-in-waiting might sit up slowly, rubbing her arms as she tried to summon warmth from a thin blanket. The stillness outside made her small movement feel startling, as though sound itself had not yet awakened. Another woman, perhaps slightly older, would already be on her feet, moving with quiet purpose as she lit a candle so dim it barely altered the darkness. These actions were not graceful. They were the routine motions of people who had long accepted that mourning belonged to duty, not comfort. The maids, who rose even earlier, moved through these dim rooms like shadows with tasks. They brushed hair in strokes that were steady but subdued, careful not to pull too sharply. They set out gowns that had been mended the night before, some clean stains on underskirts without comment, brownish marks that every woman recognized, but none spoke aloud. Blood was part of their work, part of their bodies, part of their calendar, yet it existed without acknowledgement. These stains were scrubbed away quietly, as though erasing a trace of life itself. Nothing in these hours was ever documented. yet it consumed more of their lives than the ceremonies historians love to describe. A queen, stiff from a bed that had not warmed through the night, might turn her face away as she was dressed, trying to steady the breath she did not want her attendants to notice. A young attendant might wince as her scalp tightened under the comb, but never say a word. Another might press a hand to her abdomen, feeling the dull ache of a cycle that offered no sympathy. All these moments unfolded without witness, without consideration, without space. The silence was not peaceful. It carried a tension that felt woven into the air. Every woman knew that by the time the morning bell rang, they would need to shed these private sensations and step into roles that demanded alertness, grace, and unbroken composure. It was jarring to think how swiftly they had to transform. From half-awake figures, fumbling with cold fabric, to polished silhouettes, ready to step into the machinery of court life. Modern mornings may rush people into daily routines, but the Tudor shift from vulnerability to perfection had no room for delay or mistake. What made these hours heavier still was the thought that no one would ever truly know them. These small labours, these aches, these moments when a woman swallowed her fatigue and tightened the laces of her gown over a tender body. None of it found a place in the chronicles written later. To the world outside, their days began with ceremony. Their exhaustion, their quiet suffering, their whispered sighs belonged to the realm of the invisible. And yet, these mornings shaped them more than any public appearance. They revealed who they were beneath layers of silk and duty. Each woman learned to steady herself in the dark, to gather the remnants of sleep and bind them away like secrets. They learned to carry pain through ritual, to bury longing beneath fabric, to smooth emotion into something unreadable. The palace demanded much from them, and these early hours were where they prepared the masks they would wear until night returned. It is unsettling to imagine how often they faced dawn with a kind of quiet dread, knowing the day would not belong to them, knowing their thoughts would be folded away behind rehearsed gestures. Even now, thinking of those rooms where candles flickered against stone walls, it's difficult to ignore the weight of those unrecorded mornings. If someone today rose before sunrise to clean, dress, and suppress discomfort before even being allowed a moment to breathe, it might echo the rhythm of a Tudor morning. Though nothing could match its pressure, the palace looked serene at this hour. But serenity was a lie. Beneath it lay women trying to gather themselves before the world demanded every part of them. These mornings were not gentle. They were the quiet machinery behind a court that admired elegance, but never acknowledged the cost of producing it. These dim hours held the truths that daylight masks with ceremony. In their muted breath and careful motions, another side of palace life stirs where no witness was ever meant to look. Within that grey hush lies a shift of emotion that hints at what lingers in the shadows of their rising day. Grandeur within the Tudor court was often nothing more than a distant illusion when viewed from inside a queen's private chambers. From afar, her position appeared gilded, her days adorned with ceremony and respect, her life sculpted into something enviable. Yet standing in her shoes, quietly, invisibly, revealed a solitude that thrived beneath every jewel she wore. The role others imagined as triumph was, in truth, a narrow corridor lined with expectations she never chose. Being a king's wife meant living in a cage constructed from attention. Each gesture, each pause, each smile carried weight. When she walked through a hall, nobles observed her with the same intensity they reserved for omens. Someone would always interpret her expression as approval or displeasure, her silence as calculation or weakness. Even the simple act of existing became a performance she could not abandon. And while her name travelled through the court with power, the woman behind that name often felt herself diminishing with every passing day. Within the boundaries of her rooms, the contrast between appearance and reality deepened. Heavy curtains muffled the world outside, yet never offered comfort. A queen could pace the length of her chamber without feeling any closer to herself. Furniture carved with intricate designs held no softness. Mirrors reflected only the version of her that others demanded to see. Every object around her reminded her of what she represented. Never of who she had been before. The crown settled onto her head. Servants drifted in and out, their footsteps quiet. Their hands practiced. They tended to her hair, tightened her laces, and arranged her gowns in layers that weighed more than most understood. But these attendants were not companions. They were witnesses trained to erase their own presence. They guarded her privacy by refusing to acknowledge it. Their distance formed a void around her, one that grew so familiar she sometimes forgot how human connection was supposed to feel. The king, central to her fate, occupied her life unpredictably. Some days, he arrived with warmth, other days with coldness, sharp enough to leave bruises on her spirit. He often saw her through the lens of duty rather than affection, assessing her value by her obedience, her influence, or the possibility of an heir. She learned to keep her thoughts hidden, her fears contained, her desires locked behind the same composure she displayed in public. A queen might have been surrounded by people, but she was rarely seen. Evenings intensified that isolation. When activity faded and only candlelight remained, she often sat in silence, listening to the faint crackle of the wick. The quiet reminded her of everything she could not say. Memories of simpler days sometimes rose uninvited, running through gardens without consequence, laughing without restraint, speaking without calculating every word. These recollections were bittersweet, like glimpses of a life she had traded away long before she understood the cost. Her presence in written history offered no consolation. Chronicles mentioned her at weddings, coronations, births, and political negotiations, but never in the moments where she swallowed her grief, steadied her trembling hands, or forced herself to greet courtiers who hoped to see her fail. Official accounts stripped her of nuance, reducing her to titles and events. The person she truly was, quiet, uncertain, burdened, slipped into the background, unacknowledged and unprotected. What frightened her most was the knowledge that a queen's name held power only as long as the king's favour endured. One misstep, one failed pregnancy, one shift in political alliances could render her invisible. A woman once praised for grace or virtue could be silenced overnight. Servants would speak more softly around her. Courtiers would avoid her gaze. Advisors would stop addressing her directly. In these erasures, she tasted a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear of losing everything she had been forced to uphold, and relief in not having the world watch her every breath. Obscurity brought a fragile kind of freedom. She could sit without perfect posture, breathe without considering how it appeared, and close her eyes without wondering who might misinterpret the gesture. Yet this freedom was a byproduct of abandonment, not liberation. She regained control only because she no longer mattered. In rare moments of solitude, she touched the cold stone wall beside her bed, grounding herself in something solid amid the shifting politics. She watched small beams of sunlight creep across the floor, savouring the simplicity of their movement. These fleeting sensations belonged solely to her, not to the crown, not to the court, not to the kingdom. They were the closest thing to selfhood she had left. History admired queens for their elegance, their alliances, and their roles in shaping dynasties. But the truth of their existence lived in the quiet loneliness that surrounded them, in the breath held before entering a hall full of watchers, in the trembling hidden beneath velvet sleeves, in the knowledge that they were simultaneously elevated and confined. Brilliance around her concealed a life hollowed by unspoken longing. In the quiet corners of that isolation, another truth gathers where no coronation can reach. A faint tremor of unease lingers there, hinting at a deeper shadow waiting beyond her muted composure. Glory within the Tudor court was an illusion that clung to women like a second skin, one they could never remove. No matter how deeply it chafed, they were displayed beside thrones, painted into tapestries, and placed at the centre of ceremonies. Yet, everything that appeared luminous in public often hid something far darker beneath. Those who looked at these women saw prestige, elegance, or influence, but rarely understood how fear threaded itself through every moment of their lives. Power touched them only indirectly. Like dim light cast across a shadow, they stood close to authority, but never truly held it. Queens, or mistress, and noblewomen were spoken of as though they were treasures to be positioned rather than people to be understood. Negotiations happened around them. Battles were fought because of them. Alliances were secured through them. Yet not a single voice stopped to ask what they wanted. They learned early that desire was a luxury denied to women tied to royal bloodlines. Their futures were determined by fathers, councils, ambassadors, or kings long before they reached womanhood. Even their bodies belonged more to the realm than to themselves. Inside the palace, the pressure never eased. Every woman living near the throne knew that her value rose and fell according to the needs of others. A queen might be praised for virtue one year and condemned the next for failing to produce an heir. A mistress could capture the king's eye briefly, only to be dismissed when political convenience shifted. A lady of the court might stand proudly in a place of honour at one feast and find herself exiled from the king's sight the next week. Their stability, like the moon's light, seemed to wax and wane by forces they could neither influence nor defy. What made this existence more suffocating was that the danger was rarely visible. No chain bound them physically, yet they were confined by expectation, custom, and the constant awareness that a single rumour could dismantle everything they had. Even happiness arrived tinged with caution. If a woman laughed too freely, someone might whisper that she sought inappropriate attention. If she maintained perfect composure, others would claim she was cold or scheming. No path kept them safe. Each route curved back toward scrutiny. Nights inside the palace often revealed the truth more clearly than any daylight ceremony. Women who had stood proudly in decorated halls now sat quietly in dim chambers, their thoughts heavy with the knowledge that their fates shifted with each political wave. A queen might trace patterns on the fabric of her sleeves, realizing how fragile those threads were compared to the fragility of her standing. A mistress might listen for footsteps in the corridor, knowing that the king's absence tonight could mean his interest was drifting elsewhere. A court lady might look at her reflection in a darkened window and feel herself fading, becoming indistinct in the blur of palace life. Their lives resembled that faint sliver of a new moon, visible enough to be noticed, but never bright enough to stand on its own. They glimmered briefly when politics allowed it, then dimmed again when the court decided their moment had passed. This constant shift left many women suspended between hope and dread. They adapted. They endured. They learned how to speak carefully and how to hide their emotions behind layers far thicker than their gowns. Modern imaginations often paint their stories as ones of privilege. But privilege meant little when paired with such uncertainty. The fear of falling from favour was a constant pulse beneath their skin. The knowledge that others were competing for the same influence made every conversation feel brittle. Even friendships were tested by the silent awareness that one woman's rise might require another's descent. Yet beneath all of this, there remained a quiet resilience. Some women found ways to breathe within the narrow confines of their roles. They cultivated small comforts, a favourite tapestry, a sliver of sunlight that crossed their chambers in early afternoon, a few minutes of solitude before the day's expectations flooded back. These modest moments mattered more than grand ceremonies, for they reminded them that they were still more than shadows. Historically, these women appeared only when their presence disrupted or supported a political story, but their real lives unfolded in the spaces history ignored. In the tremble of a hand, the stiffness of a forced smile, the exhaustion hidden beneath silk, They lived beside the center of power, yet remained trapped in its dimmest edges. Brilliance surrounding them concealed truth. H. Sharpened by fear and uncertainty. Within that uncertain glow, another layer of their world gathers quietly where ambition meets vulnerability. Faint tension lingers there, pointing toward deeper, unraveling, slipping just beyond the reach of these dim hours. Night inside the Tudor palace carried its own vocabulary. Quiet sounds that slipped through corridors and touched only the ears of women who lived beneath the weight of expectation. Long after guards finished their rounds and torches burned low. Faint noises threaded through stone halls like secret messages. These murmurs revealed truths daylight refused to acknowledge. Men slept. Councils dispersed. Servants retreated. Yet women remained alert to signals pressed into darkness. Soft clicks echoed from distant doors. Hesitant, yet unmistakable. A forbidden meeting might be unfolding behind one of those heavy panels. Someone entering quietly. Someone waiting within shadows. Women learned to recognize the rhythm of such visits. A long pause. Then a careful turn of iron hinges. Not enough to startle guards, but enough for those nearby to sense intention drifting through dim light. These sounds held tension no document ever captured. Tension suspended between desire, fear, and consequences too large to speak aloud. Breaths in the dark held their own meaning. Within chambers, where candles dwindled to thread-like flames, women sometimes heard sharp intakes of air. Then, soft, trembling exhalations. Such sounds carried uncertainty. Were they signs of longing or terror? Someone's heart might leap toward comfort, or recoil from danger. In the stillness, breath revealed truths. Mouths could not risk forming. Every gasp felt like a confession swallowed before words emerged. Across rooms where sewing implements never slept, needles slid through cloth with tiny metallic whispers. Stitches formed in the quiet hours when worry kept women awake. Embroidery that looked serene by daylight was often born from restless nights filled with muffled fears. Each thread pulled tight sealed emotions society forbade them to express. Needles pierced fabric the way their lives pierced through constant boundaries. Quietly, precisely, without ever disturbing the structures built around them. These sounds became part of their bodies. A queen lying sleepless might count them like beads on a rosary, listening for hints of shifting alliances or private betrayals. A lady-in-waiting sitting beside her small window might freeze when she heard footsteps where none should exist. A mistress might hear rising breaths in the corridor and wonder whether tonight would bring comfort, danger, or silence heavy enough to bruise the spirit. Men judged their world through decrees and arguments. Women judged theirs through sounds too subtle for politics, but powerful enough to alter destinies. Even the weather outside touched their nights differently. Wind moaned through narrow openings, pushing cold drafts over skin dressed in thin linen. To some, the wind sounded like a warning, unsettling enough to stir unease deep in the chest. To others, it seemed like a companion, one of the few forces moving freely through walls that confined them. Raindrops tapping stone created rhythms that sometimes soothed, sometimes reminded them how small their voices felt in the world that surrounded them. These nocturnal notes formed a hidden map of palace life. Women knew which doors creaked, which servants shuffled softly, which courtiers disguised their movements with care. Knowledge gathered through listening offered protection. Silence taught them how to survive. They navigated politics not through direct influence, but through understanding what sounds meant. When to respond, when to disappear into quiet, when to pretend they heard nothing at all. Looking from the present, it feels almost unreal to imagine how fully their safety depended on the interpretation of insignificant noises. Modern walls seldom carry whispers of danger or desire. Yet in the Tudor palace, nothing was ever harmless. Every click, every breath, every stitch echoed through lives, bound tightly to roles they did not choose. Those faint sounds contained entire narratives that the official record never attempted to explore. Women who lived there shaped their inner worlds through these nightly signals. Hidden longing, buried worry, fleeting hope. All of it rose and fell, with each sound drifting through chambers dimmed by fatigue. Even when they wished to rest, their bodies remained attuned. Ears listened, while minds struggled to soften. Darkness amplified everything they tried to quiet within themselves. What history remembers are decisions announced during council, marriages forged for power, and scandals burst into daylight. What it forgets is how deeply women absorbed the sounds of their surroundings, how their hearts tightened or softened based on noises no scribe recorded. Within these unspoken exchanges, their truth persisted, fragile, trembling, unprotected. Quiet hours held depth unseen by formal chronicles, depths revealed through sounds slipping through dim corridors. Within those subtle echoes rests insight into lives bound tightly within strict walls. Murmurs persist there, hinting toward unrest, stirring somewhere beyond cold stone silence. Within the Tudor court, spoken words were never the safest form of communication. Every sentence risked being overheard, twisted, or repeated with venomous intent. Women learned quickly that silence protected them far better than speech ever could. Yet silence created an unexpected battlefield of its own. A realm where glances, sidelong looks, and lingering eyes carried more weight than entire conversations. In those vast halls lined with tapestries and ambition, the language of the gaze governed everything. Walking through a long corridor meant navigating currents of unspoken meaning. A noblewoman might glance briefly at another across the polished floor, conveying caution, curiosity, or warning without a syllable. These looks were swift, practiced, born from an instinct sharpened by survival. Even the slightest narrowing of an eyelid could reveal alliances forming or dissolving. The court thrived on this muted exchange, where a woman who understood the subtleties of expression held a quiet advantage over those who depended on words. The most feared eyes in the palace belonged to the king. Women studied them as though their futures were hidden within each flicker of his attention. Some learned to lower their gaze at just the right moment, signaling humility without appearing weak. Others held his eyes a fraction longer, suggesting confidence without provoking displeasure. A few, daring or desperate, allowed themselves to meet his stare directly, an act as bold as stepping onto thin ice. Everything depended on timing. Everything depended on perception. One misplaced glance could reshape a family's fortune, elevate or destroy a reputation, or invite scrutiny that no one wanted. Courtiers often misinterpreted these silent exchanges. But misinterpretation was dangerous in itself. If a woman looked towards someone at the wrong instant, others might whisper that she sought influence, affection, or treachery. If she avoided an individual entirely, rumors might claim she held a secret fear or guilt. Neutrality was nearly impossible. The court demanded performance even in stillness, and women bore the burden of managing expressions too fleeting to record, yet too powerful to ignore. Inside grand halls where feasts took place, the tension of these glances grew sharper. Women seated in precise arrangements felt dozens of eyes skimming across them, evaluating posture, attire, subtle reactions. A raised eyebrow from a rival across the table might imply triumph. A softened gaze from another might offer temporary solidarity. During dances, women measured every look they gave and received, knowing that observers searched for the slightest sign of impropriety. No step or turn was free from watchfulness. Even in private chambers, where walls muted distant voices, women could not always escape the weight of unspoken observation. A lady in waiting might notice a companion avoiding her eyes and sense that a dangerous rumor was taking form. A queen might meet the gaze of a servant and read fear where she expected loyalty. Eyes revealed things that mouths never dared to express: resentment, I hope, exhaustion, longing. These glimpses into another's truth were often brief, but they could cut deeper than any spoken sentence. In many ways, this reliance on silent communication reflected the strict boundaries placed on women. Words carried risk. Looks became safer tools. Though still fraught with danger, women developed instincts sharper than steel, learning to read a room before stepping fully inside it. They watched how heads tilted, how eyes shifted, how expressions froze momentarily when news drifted through the court. These small signs guided them far more effectively than counsel from advisors who rarely understood their precarious positions. Modern eyes might underestimate the significance of these small gestures, imagining that politics existed only in letters, proclamations, and alliances. Yet within the palace walls, politics seeped into every glance that lingered too long or avoided contact altogether. Women became experts in the delicate art of communicating emotion without sound, a skill that, for many, was the thin barrier between safety and ruin. The peril of misreading an expression was ever present. A lady who misjudged the king's mood could unintentionally provoke suspicion. A queen who allowed grief to flicker in her expression might be labelled unstable. A courtier who smiled at the wrong moment might be accused of scheming. Expressions that lasted no longer than a heartbeat could spark lifelong consequences. Still, within this dangerous landscape of silent observation, women found ways to assert themselves. A single steady look could communicate defiance. A carefully softened expression could protect an ally. A moment of still, unwavering eye contact could reclaim dignity that others tried to erode. These acts were subtle, but in a world where everything spoken was monitored, subtlety became a weapon, sharpened through necessity. Their eyes carried stories history never preserved, warnings exchanged in the blink of an eye, alliances forged in a fleeting moment of recognition, grievances hidden behind lowered lashes. They shaped relationships, protected secrets, and sometimes determined fates. The court may have silenced their voices, but their eyes spoke with a force no decree could restrain. Glances drifting through those vast halls revealed tensions deeper than spoken debate. Within such muted exchanges rests insight into motives shaped quietly by fear and ambition. Shadows of intent gather there, hinting toward consequences rising from silence woven into every passing look. Friendship inside the Tudor palace did not resemble the warm companionship people imagine when thinking of shared laughter or easy conversations. Within these stone walls, connection grew out of necessity, silence, and the quiet recognition of mirrored suffering. Women who lived entirely different lives by rank often found themselves bound together by experiences no one else could understand. A queen and her maid might never share equal ground in daylight. Yet after the rituals faded, their loneliness aligned in ways neither would dare acknowledge aloud. Some evenings, a maid would unfold a thin blanket beside the queen's bed, not as a servant awaiting command, but as someone offering the only comfort she possessed. Cold seeped into the chambers during long winters, and the luxury of warmth was unevenly distributed. Sharing a blanket, even briefly, softened the boundaries drawn so tightly by rank. The queen, wrapped in layers of protocol, felt her isolation loosen just enough for breath to come evenly again. The maid, accustomed to invisibility, felt herself seen as more than hands performing endless tasks. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Tea, simple and unadorned, became another quiet bridge between their worlds. Poured into modest cups, the warm liquid carried more solace than ceremony. They drank slowly, letting the steam rise between them like a fragile veil, shielding their thoughts from the palace outside. A sip could ease tension in the chest, soften the stiffness in the throat, or calm nerves strained from navigating the demands of court life. Those small cups held more truth than any council meeting or royal feast. Within those moments, The difference between queen and servant diminished until it felt nearly invisible. Whispers often emerged during these shared hours. Uncertain, hushed, spoken only when the corridor beyond their door fell completely still. The queen might confide a fear she could never reveal to advisors or family. The maid might share a grief too small for the world to notice, but too large for her to carry alone. These exchanges did not reshape history or influence politics. They simply allowed two human beings to survive another day. Such tenderness had no place in the written record. Yet it sustained them far more deeply than the formal relationships surrounding them. During daylight hours, the illusion of distance returned. The queen walked ahead with her back straight, and the maid followed with her eyes lowered. Their hands seldom brushed, their voices rarely overlapped. Yet beneath these rigid roles lived the faint memory of nighttime solidarity. A glance exchanged across the room, or a softened tone was enough to recall the warmth shared between them when the court was no longer watching. Their friendship existed in fragments, held together by silence rather than declarations. These relationships, built in secrecy, reflected the deeper truth of palace life. Isolation touched every woman, regardless of status. A noblewoman with 20 attendants might feel as lonely as a maid housed in a narrow, drafty chamber. Connection thrived not in privilege, but in vulnerability, the kind revealed only when public roles dissolved. In these rare instances, two women could set aside titles and meet as equals in quiet exhaustion. Modern imagination often romanticizes royal companionship, envisioning confident queens surrounded by loyal attendants. The reality was far more fragile. Friendship grew not from scenes of shared luxury, but from brushing tears away discreetly, from repairing torn hems in lamplight, from offering steady presence when words carried too much risk. Each act of kindness was small, but its meaning multiplied in an environment where emotional safety existed only in the shadows. What made these friendships uniquely painful was their impermanence. A maid could be reassigned without warning, sent away due to illness, scandal, or a shift in household structure. A queen might lose a confidant because of political pressure or the king's suspicion. These separations cut deeply, leaving behind traces of longing no one acknowledged. And because no chronicler deemed such relationships worthy of ink, they vanished as quietly as they had formed, leaving only faint memories within the hearts of women conditioned to endure solitude. Still, for the brief time they existed, these bonds brought warmth to lives otherwise shaped by scrutiny. They offered reminders that beneath layers of silk, beneath restrictions of duty, beneath exhaustion of performance, there persisted something stubbornly human, a touch on the wrist, a shared blanket edge, a whispered reassurance. These gestures kept despair from hardening beyond repair. History rarely remembers women who comforted one another in the dark, but their presence shaped the texture of palace life far more than grand events ever could. Through them, women found reasons to rise each morning, reasons to steady themselves in the face of uncertainty, reasons to keep breathing within walls that cared nothing for their survival. Hidden companionship offered strength no ceremony could replace, strength that lived quietly in moments untouched by rank. Within that fragile connection rests insight into lives softened briefly by shared burdens. Echoes of such bonds drift onward, hinting toward deeper ties forming in silence, where watchful eyes cannot intrude. Ink inside, the Tudor palace carried a kind of danger that few outside those walls ever understood. For women who lived under constant surveillance, by servants, by rivals, by political forces they could not name, writing became both salvation and risk. A letter allowed them to breathe, to let their thoughts spill into a space not controlled by protocol. But the moment the ink dried, danger gathered around every word. What they wrote could comfort them for a moment, yet ruin them for a lifetime. In narrow chambers, lit only by a single candle, a woman might unfold a scrap of parchment she had hidden beneath layers of linen. Her hand trembled slightly as she dipped the quill, not because she feared the act of writing itself, but because she feared what would happen if anyone discovered her intent. Letters carried emotion, longing, truth, things the court preferred women to keep silent. So she wrote slowly, as though each line might betray her if shaped too boldly. Some letters spoke of homesickness. A queen might write to a distant sister, describing the coldness of the palace and the weight of expectation pressing against her ribs. A lady in waiting might send words to her mother, recalling memories of warmth no longer found within these stone walls. Their sentences flowed with a softness they could show nowhere else. These moments of tenderness were rare and fragile, pressed into the parchment like petals stored between heavy books. Other letters contained fears they dared not voice aloud. They wrote of shifting alliances, of whispered threats, of the uncertainty that darkened their days. They wrote about the king's changing moods, the court's unpredictable storms, the toll of pretending they felt nothing while carrying everything. Ink allowed them to shape sorrow into sentences, transforming silent suffering into lines that felt almost like confession. But many of these letters would never leave the room in which they were created. Women often paused midway, struck by the realization that sending such words might bring suspicion upon themselves or harm upon those they loved. Eyes in the palace were everywhere. A message intercepted by the wrong hands could be twisted into an accusation. Even innocent affection could be spun into treason. And so the ink dried. But the letter remained stillborn. Tears blurred some of these pages before the women could finish them. Droplets of grief spread the ink until their thoughts dissolved into smudges. They sometimes pressed the back of their hand against their eyes, frustrated not by emotion itself, but by the knowledge that even their tears had no safe place here. A maid cleaning the chamber the next morning might find a scrap of parchment tucked beneath a pillow. Its words softened beyond recognition, its meaning hidden forever. Many letters met an even harsher fate. With trembling fingers, their writers held them over a candle flame, watching fire curl the corners inward. The parchment blackened, folded in on itself, and vanished before it could betray the truth it held. Women tended the flame like mourners at a private funeral, burying what they wished they could say, destroying the only witness to their deeper selves. The ashes scattered easily, yet the weight of what they had written remained inside them. These unsent letters formed an invisible archive that the palace would never acknowledge. They contained everything history failed to preserve: quiet despair, forbidden hope, raw honesty, and the inner worlds of women the court preferred to flatten into titles. Each letter, destroyed, of hidden, or tucked away, captured a moment when a woman allowed herself to exist beyond performance. Even now, imagining those nights evokes a strange ache. The sight of a woman bent over her writing desk while the palace slept, her candle flickering, her face shadowed, her thoughts spilling across a page she would never dare send, reveals more truth about court life than any chronicle written by men. Modern readers might wonder why she didn't rebel, didn't flee, didn't demand freedom. But rebellion in the Tudor world did not always look like action. Sometimes it looked like ink drying on a letter that would never be seen by another soul. These letters were not meant to change kingdoms. They were meant to keep their writers alive. Writing allowed women to gather themselves when the court threatened to dissolve them. It was a way to reclaim a quiet part of their identity, a part untouched by gossip or expectation, even if no one else ever read their words. The act itself stitched together pieces of their spirits, frayed by the demands of palace life. History has no record of these small rebellions. It remembers treaties, scandals, executions, but not the woman who stayed awake through the night to finish a letter she knew she would destroy before dawn. Yet these unwitnessed moments formed the emotional backbone of their existence. Their ink, though unseen, shaped their resilience. Silent writing offered release, denied by spoken words. Release held briefly within dim chambers, Within those fading lines rests insight into lives carried beneath layers of caution. Echoes of unsent confessions linger still, hinting toward turmoil building where words dared not travel. Within the grandeur of the Tudor court, queens were displayed as symbols of purity, lineage, and stability, their lives woven into the political fabric of kingdoms. Yet behind the royal veneer lay an ache so deep that even the thickest palace walls could not fully contain it. These women moved through corridors filled with gilded light, yet grief clung to them like a second shadow, one that no painter captured and no historian honored. The world remembered their husbands' triumphs, victories, and decrees, but the sorrow that shaped their days slipped quietly into darkness. Unrecorded, for many queens, motherhood defined their worth long before they ever held a child. The pressure to bear heirs settled heavily on their shoulders, turning each month into a cycle of hope and dread. When bleeding stopped, attendants whispered possibilities. When it returned, disappointment swept through the palace with unbearable force. Even joy carried fear. Pregnancy meant survival for the dynasty, but danger for the mother. Some women prayed softly before sleep, asking for strength not for themselves, but for a baby not yet born. Birth chambers, far removed from the ceremonial splendor of the throne room, revealed truths that court life preferred not to acknowledge. Queens labored for hours in rooms lit by wavering candles, surrounded by midwives who knew how easily triumph could turn to tragedy. The air filled with whispered encouragement, the sharp scent of sweat, the quiet urgency of hands trying to steady trembling limbs. There was no music, not procession, no celebration, only pain that shook the core of their being. On the stone floors beside the bed, drops of blood gathered into small, dark memories of the life being fought for. When a new heir finally cried out, the palace erupted in celebration. Courtiers cheered, church bells rang, and the king's proclamation travelled swiftly through the kingdom. Yet the queen, still in agony, lay exhausted beyond recognition, her breath thin, her body trembling. Every cheer in the distance felt like another weight placed upon her fragile ribs. Pain was expected, almost demanded, yet rarely acknowledged. Her suffering served the monarchy, but did not belong to its stories. And not every birth ended in joy. Some queens felt their infants grow still in their arms, their breath slipping away before the world could welcome them. Others watched children survive only days, their small forms wrapped in white cloth before being carried to quiet resting places far from the court's gaze. Women learned to bury their heartbreak with poise, shedding tears only when alone or when darkness finally softened their restraint. A queen's mourning had to remain elegant, measured, controlled, an impossible demand upon a mother's shattered soul. Within the palace at night, grief often revealed itself through faint sounds, muffled by heavy stone. A queen might stifle her sobs with a piece of linen, gripping it tightly until her hands ached. Tears soaked the fabric, leaving stains that no servant questioned. These private wails, never meant to echo beyond the chamber, were absorbed by walls accustomed to secrets. The palace, so proud in daylight, felt strangely hollow in these moments, as though it, too, leaned toward her sorrow. Loneliness deepened the wound. Queens lacked the freedom to confide openly. Political eyes watched their every gesture. Any show of weakness might be twisted into accusation or used to undermine their standing. Even other women in the court, though sympathetic, tread carefully. Comfort offered at the wrong time could be misread. Comfort withheld might harden a heart. The queen existed between sympathy and suspicion, haunted by both. Years passed. Pregnancies came and went, and grief accumulated quietly, layer upon layer, beneath gowns embroidered with gold thread. The court demanded she remain composed. radiant, dignified, even as loss carved hollows in her spirit. History books later would mention her only briefly, as mother of one heir, or wife discarded for another, or name tied to scandal. But they would not mention her trembling hands. They would not mention her tears. They would not mention how she survived sorrow that might have broken anyone else. From a modern perspective, it is unsettling to imagine how deeply these women suffered behind masks crafted to preserve the royal image. Today, a mother grieving her child receives compassion, space to mourn, and the freedom to speak openly of her pain. In the Tudor world, grief was a burden carried in silence, hidden behind ceremonial silk. The contrast is stark enough to make the heart tighten. In truth, these queens lived not as figures of majesty, but as women trying to endure under the weight of expectations far larger than their fragile bodies could bear. Their tears never shaped treaties. Their despair never altered chronicles. And their sorrow never appeared in portraits. Yet their pain formed the quiet undercurrent of a dynasty that relied on their endurance more than it ever admitted. Sorrow carried through those chambers reveals truth far deeper than royal ceremony ever allowed. Within that muted anguish rises understanding of lives pressed relentlessly beneath duty. Soft remnants of their grief linger still, hinting toward burdens gathering quietly inside the hour that waits beyond this one. Menstruation inside the Tudor palace held a meaning far heavier than any natural cycle should have carried. For women of the court, especially queens and noble consorts, each month became a verdict. Blood on the linen signalled failure, disappointment, and the tightening of pressure from all sides. Absence of blood signalled possibility, yet brought another kind of fear, the fear of surviving pregnancy, of childbed death, of expectations sharpening into demands. Their bodies, treated as instruments of succession, became battlegrounds where hope and dread collided in silence. In the first light of morning, when the palace still rested in grey quiet, a woman might rise slowly from her bed, tense with uncertainty. Her hand would travel down the folds of her gown, feeling for warmth, dampness, or the absence of both. This ritual, performed each month with trembling restraint, determined her standing more powerfully than any courtly skill she possessed. She waited, breath barely moving, as though exhaling might alter her fate. When blood appeared, a wave of complex emotion washed over her. Relief that she was not bearing a dangerous child, fear that she would be judged unworthy, sorrow that her value might diminish in the king's eyes, resentment toward a world that measured her entirely through her womb. Servants, trained to read the queen's mood without asking questions, moved subtly around her, adjusting their quietness, sensing what she could not voice. Even they understood how much a single stain could shift alliances. When blood did not appear, anxiety deepened. A missed cycle could end in a celebrated pregnancy or a devastating disappointment. It might bring honor or death. Whispers rippled through the palace before she even confirmed the truth. Attendants watched her movements closely, as if her steps carried prophecy. The king's advisors grew alert. Court rivals sharpened their calculations. The queen herself felt the air around her change. Thickening with expectation, she had no power to escape. In these moments, she often reached for the privacy she could never fully have. Behind closed doors, she might lay a hand across her stomach, imagining a heartbeat or fearing the absence of one. She might kneel in prayer, not for glory, but for survival. A child could secure her position, a miscarriage could condemn her. And all the while, she carried the knowledge that her body's betrayal, one way or another, would be whispered throughout the palace long before she could gather her own thoughts. Even women outside the royal household felt this burden. Ladies in waiting, brides of noblemen, daughters of ambitious families, all lived under the same unspoken law. Fertility was duty. and any deviation from it brought scrutiny. Menstruation became a clock, counting down their usefulness. Each cycle narrowing their choices. Young women feared being branded barren. Older women feared being replaced. What should have been a private rhythm turned into public judgment. These pressures carved themselves into small, unremarkable gestures unseen by official histories. A woman smoothing her skirts nervously during audiences. A queen gripping the edge of her chair when a sudden cramp seized her. A lady pressing a folded cloth beneath her gown during ceremonies. Hoping no stain escaped. The palace demanded perfection, but bodies remained imperfect, unpredictable, human. That humanity often became their greatest vulnerability. There were moments when menstruation arrived unexpectedly in the midst of ritual or diplomacy. Women learned to remain composed, even when fear spread through their veins. A single drop could be misinterpreted as weakness or a divine sign, and because no one openly acknowledged these realities, they suffered alone beneath layers of silk. They moved with shallow steps, controlled breath, and practiced stillness, hiding pain behind etiquette's mask. At night, when exhaustion softened their posture, some women allowed their grief to surface. They wondered why their worth depended on cycles beyond their control. They wondered how a world ruled by men could decide so completely what their bodies meant. They wondered whether their own desires mattered at all. In the dimness, with only a candle for company, they traced memories of home, of simpler days before their futures became tethered to lineage and anatomy. Modern eyes may struggle to grasp how deeply menstruation shaped a Tudor woman's existence. Today, it is a biological fact, acknowledged without ceremony. In their world, it was a signpost pointing toward destiny, praise, accusation, or danger. Their lives swung between two uncertainties, bleeding that condemned, and absence that threatened. They watched themselves carefully. As though their bodies were unpredictable animals, they had no choice but to obey. No chronicle captures these quiet fears. No historian records the moment a queen closed her eyes after discovering blood on a linen cloth, fighting the tremor rising through her chest. No painting depicts the tightening in her throat as she prepared to face the court with news she never chose. Yet these moments shaped her life every bit as much as marriage alliances or royal decrees. Hidden dread within those cycles reveals truths untouched by ceremony. Truths carried silently in chambers, filled with expectation. Within those strained hours grows understanding of lives, shaped mercilessly by forces beyond their will. Traces of that burden drift onward, hinting toward deeper unease, lying just beneath the stillness ahead. Night inside the Tudor palace pressed down heavily, the kind of darkness that softened edges but sharpened loneliness. Many women slept 2 or 3 to a bed, not from affection, but from necessity. Winter seeped through stone walls, and firewood remained carefully rationed. Sharing warmth became the only defense against the cold that crawled into their bones. Yet even in close quarters, comfort remained distant. Their bodies lay inches apart, but their thoughts drifted through separate corridors of worry, fear, and unanswered longing. They settled into narrow mattresses, stuffed with feathers that shifted beneath every movement. Sheets, washed far less often than anyone wished, carried faint traces of lavender, sweat, old tears, and the lingering scent of wood smoke from the dying hearth. A woman might turn her back to the other, adjusting the thin blanket so it reached her shoulders, hoping the small gesture of self-protection did not appear selfish. The bed creaked softly each time someone breathed too deeply. Their nights did not bring rest. Instead, they felt the weight of tomorrow pressing into their spines. Lying there with them in the cramped space, a lady-in-waiting rehearsed court responses in her head, knowing one misplaced word could spark consequences. A maid worried about the queen's unpredictable mood. A noblewoman feared the judgment that might fall on her husband at dawn. None shared these thoughts aloud, The silence between them held more truth than any conversation. In the dimness, the glow of embers cast faint patterns on the walls. The light rose and fell with each flicker, shifting like breath. Some women watched those shadows until their eyes burned, using them as an anchor or a distraction. Others closed their eyes tightly, hoping the darkness behind their eyelids might feel gentler than the darkness around them. But sleep rarely arrived. Exhaustion clung too tightly to their muscles, weighing them down, yet refusing to release them into dreams. Occasionally, one woman shifted, causing warmth to redistribute. A hand brushed another's back by accident, sending a small jolt of awareness through both. They pulled away instinctively, not out of disgust, but out of fear. Fear of appearing vulnerable. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear that even an innocent touch might spark rumors. The palace watched everything, even in sleep. Some nights, someone whispered a short prayer, not for miracles. Those never came, but for endurance. A whispered plea for strength felt safer than speaking of hope. Hope could betray. Endurance kept them alive. Their voices trembled with fatigue. Yet the quiet sound filled the darkness more warmly than the hearth ever could. A second woman might murmur an amen, barely audible. A third might simply breathe a little easier, comforted by the knowledge that she was not the only one struggling. Rain added another layer to their nights. Drops tapped against the shutters rhythmically, a reminder of the world beyond the palace. Wind moaned through narrow windows, carrying cold air that slipped beneath blankets. Women tightened their embrace around themselves, curling inward, as though shrinking might help them disappear from expectation. Some longed for a childhood bed far away, where worries had been small and nights had not felt so heavy. En rare occasion, someone broke the silence. A soft voice asked, "Are you awake?" The question carried no curiosity, only a need for reassurance. If another woman replied with a simple yes, they shared a few sentences in hushed tones. Nothing important, nothing revealing, just enough human contact to keep despair at bay. These exchanges faded quickly, swallowed by caution. But for brief moments, warmth existed. Yet even these nights of shared proximity could not create dreams. Women lay with eyes half closed, drifting at the edge of consciousness. But sleep eluded them. Their bodies were too tense, their minds too full, their futures too uncertain. Dreams required softness, a loosening of the heart, a feeling of safety. None of these existed. Instead, their nights felt like long corridors stretching endlessly, with dawn the only door at the far end. When morning finally arrived, light crept across the room slowly, revealing exhaustion etched across their faces. They sat up together, but solitude returned instantly. Their roles resumed. The noblewoman prepared for court. The maid rushed to begin her duties. The lady-in-waiting straightened her hair with trembling fingers. The night's intimacy dissolved into another memory that could never be acknowledged. No chronicle recorded these sleepless nights. Paintings showed queens resting gracefully, ladies poised in elegance, servants neat and composed. But beneath those images lived the truth. Women who survived darkness inches from one another, yet miles from peace. These shared beds carried the imprint of countless silent worries, unspoken comfort, and longing for rest that never came. Their nights revealed what daylight concealed, women who bore burdens with quiet endurance, who faced cold floors and colder expectations, who found warmth only through nearness, not through freedom. They slept without dreams, because dreaming required hope. And hope was dangerous, in a world where tomorrow could unravel everything they knew. Rest denied within those narrow beds exposes truth blurred by daylight. Truth held tightly in hours, governed by fear of what lies ahead. Within that muted struggle rises understanding of lives steadied by endurance alone. Soft impressions of their sleepless quiet remain, hinting toward weight gathering inside the chamber, waiting beyond this dim hour. Court life wrapped women in layers of silk and ceremony. Yet beneath these fabrics lay a truth sharper than any blade. Their bodies served as bargaining tools in games they never chose to play. From the moment a young girl entered the palace, whether as noble daughter, distant cousin, or carefully selected attendant, her worth became measured not by her thoughts, her kindness, or her resolve, but by the usefulness of her flesh. Beauty raised her value, purity preserved it, and the slightest rumor threatened to destroy it entirely. She learned quickly that her body did not belong to her. It belonged to alliances, ambitions, and decisions whispered far beyond her control. A noble family might send a daughter into royal service with pride, yet the meaning behind that pride carried bitterness. She became an offering, presented with a polite smile, but heavy expectations. If the king noticed her, fortune might follow. If he ignored her, she risked fading into obscurity. If he used her as a pawn in political negotiations, she had no choice but to comply. Her tears never altered outcomes. Her silence was simply part of the exchange. Some women entered the palace already aware of this fate, trained from girlhood to hold their posture in ways that pleased observers, to maintain a soft gaze that hid fear, to walk as though gliding across the floor. Others arrived unprepared, startled by how quickly strangers evaluated them. Their hands, shoulders, lips, hair, every detail became a point of assessment. Eyes followed them constantly, calculating their worth with eerie precision. Compliments felt like warnings. Criticisms felt like wounds carved too deep to mend. Beauty acted as currency, but it was also a threat. Women who possessed it attracted attention they could not decline. A queen might watch with tightened jaw as a new lady-in-waiting entered the court, shimmering like a poem brought to life. The king's gaze lingered a little too long. Courtiers whispered a little too quickly, and the young woman felt pressure closing around her like a fist. Beauty raised her position, yet also painted a target on her back. Jealousy, speculation, and resentment followed her everywhere. She lived within admiration that could turn to hostility in an instant. Purity, however, wielded even greater power. A woman's entire future could hinge on whether others believed she remained untouched. Rumor alone could ruin her. Servants spoke of sightings, glances, accidental touch, none of which required truth to become damning. Men who enjoyed far more freedom walked unscathed through scandal. But for women, a single suggestion of impropriety tightened the walls around them. They became suspect, undesirable, or expendable. Few asked whether these women felt affection for the men they were paired with. Love remained irrelevant. Their marriages, their opportunities, even their survival depended on strategic placement. A young woman might be promised to a widower twice her age because it benefited her family. Another might be kept near the king, not for companionship, but to ensure that his loyalties remained predictable. Their hearts received no consideration. Their bodies bore the consequences. In dim chambers late at night, some women sat on the edge of their beds, hands resting on their laps, wondering how much of themselves remained unclaimed. They recalled simpler moments from their childhood, running barefoot across fields, laughing without permission, dreaming without consequence. Now, each breath felt choreographed, each gesture weighed, each expression observed. The palace demanded not simply their presence, but their submission. Those who tried to resist found the consequences merciless. A woman who refused a strategic marriage risked shame or imprisonment. One who rejected the king's advances faced exile or worse. Even small acts, lingering too long at a window, speaking too freely to another attendant, showing hesitation during court rituals, could ignite suspicion. The palace did not punish rebellion loudly, it punished it subtly, stripping dignity piece by piece until the woman learned compliance as a means of survival. Yet within these constraints lived small rebellions, invisible to the court. A woman might refuse to smile when expected, keeping her face cold enough to unsettle those watching. Another might confide in a trusted friend, sharing thoughts no one intended her to have. Even holding on to memories of her younger self became a quiet form of defiance. These moments did not undo the palace's control, but they preserved fragments of identity the court could not fully erase. Still, the truth remained. Their bodies existed as negotiation points in agreements they never witnessed. Families calculated their futures. Courtiers used them as leverage. Kings chose them, discarded them, desired them, or ignored them, all based on what served their power. Women became vessels carrying the ambitions of others, and the world insisted this was honor rather than imprisonment. History rarely names these women. It remembers alliances, treaties, and heirs, but forgets the trembling hands that signed their fates. It forgets the silent tears shed before weddings that felt more like sentences. It forgets the weight carried within bodies, treated as extensions of the monarchy rather than lives in their own right. Unseen strain within their measured steps reveals truth far removed from ceremonial splendor. Truth shaped quietly through demands placed upon their bodies. Within those restrained moments grows understanding of lives pressed into roles they never chose. Subtle tension holds its place there, hinting toward deeper sacrifice, waiting inside the chambers that drift just beyond this hour. Childbirth, inside the Tudor palace, unfolded behind doors, so heavily secured that even sound struggled to escape. Women entered those rooms, knowing that their lives, both physical and political, balanced on a single night. No midwife could promise safety. No physician could guarantee survival. Pain arrived in waves that bent their bodies inward. Yet no one rushed to comfort them. The palace demanded heirs, not compassion. And each woman learned to endure suffering with the silence expected of royalty. A queen or noblewoman lay on a narrow bed draped in dark fabric meant to shield her from cold draughts. A single candle flickered on the table, its flame bending as though unwilling to witness what would follow. The air carried the smell of sweat and old stone. Near the bed, a folded cloth soaked in warm water waited to catch the blood that everyone knew would come. There were no soothing medicines, no trained anesthetics, only the sharp burn of cheap liquor and a strip of linen she bit down on when contractions tore through her. Women who once carried themselves with regal composure writhed under the force of pain that showed no regard for status. Their hands clawed at the sheets, gripping until their knuckles whitened. Their breaths grew ragged, filling the room in uneven bursts. Every sensation radiated outward, the tightening of muscles, the fear rising in their throats, the pressure that felt unbearable, yet inescapable. They cried out only when the agony peaked beyond restraint. But even then, the sound remained strangely muted, as if the palace itself swallowed their voices. Attendants kept their distance. Maids lined the walls, backs pressed flat against the cold stone, eyes lowered to the floor. They did not dare look directly at the woman giving birth. Doing so risked accusation or dismissal. They heard everything, the muffled cries, the harsh breathing, the sudden whimpers when another contraction slammed through her. Their hands trembled, though hidden carefully in their skirts. None spoke unless summoned by the midwife. And even then, their words came out quiet and trembling. The midwife, seasoned but solemn, worked quickly. Her expression locked in, practiced calm. She wiped sweat from the mother's brow, checked her progress, and murmured instructions meant more to steady the atmosphere than to comfort. The queen clung to those gestures not because they eased pain, but because they reminded her she was not entirely alone. Her fear remained unspoken, etched instead in the way her eyes darted toward the doorway. as if half expecting a miracle or half fearing a messenger with bad news. Every birth in the palace carried dread. Infection lurked in the shadows. Blood loss waited like a silent predator. And the unpredictable shift of the child's position could turn triumph into tragedy within minutes. Women prayed quietly between contractions, not only for their own lives, but for the fragile ones struggling to emerge into a world that demanded so much from them already. Some recited familiar prayers, others whispered pleas shaped only by desperation. When the baby finally came, its first cry sliced through the room like a blade. For a moment, everyone froze. The Queen sobbed from exhaustion. Not joy, not relief, simply release. Her body shook as she collapsed onto the damp pillows. The midwife cut the cord swiftly, wrapping the infant in cloth, checking the color of its skin with trained eyes. Only after confirming life did she announce the outcome. Outside the chamber, courtiers waited as if listening to distant omens. If the child survived, celebrations would begin. If the child died, silence thickened the hallway, heavy enough to suffocate. Inside the room, women resumed their roles as if nothing monumental had happened. The Queen received news with trembling hands, her expression restrained despite the torrent of emotion beneath. She cried only when no one stood close enough to witness, and when the infant did not cry, when its chest did not rise. The room changed shape entirely. The midwife lowered her head. Maids pressed their lips shut. The Queen's face drained of colour as she looked toward the bundle that would never grow. A thin wail escaped her throat, quickly smothered by the cloth she bit earlier. Even grief needed to remain quiet. Nobles disliked the sound of despair. It made them uncomfortable. In such moments, attendants moved softly, aware that every gesture mattered. They washed the Queen's hands, cleaned the linens, and prepared the small, still body for burial. No formal mourning would be held. No portrait would be painted. No chronicle would record the loss. The palace treated infant death like an inconvenience, something to be tidied away, hidden from view, and forgotten by morning. But the mothers never forgot. Their bodies remembered every contraction, every moment of terror, every breath held in uncertainty. Their hearts carried the weight of tiny lives lost in silence, lives taken before they could even be named. They walked through the palace afterward with a new kind of stiffness, as though part of their spirit remained in that dim room where they had fought so fiercely to survive. History mentions royal births only when they change the line of succession. It never speaks of the dozens of nights where women laboured in agony, surrounded by stone walls that absorbed their suffering. It never speaks of their courage, their loneliness, their quiet endurance. Those stories lived only within them, carried through their remaining days like shadows, clinging to their skirts. Pain endured within those chamber walls exposes truths untouched by celebration, truths shaped by struggle, more profound than any ceremony. Within that sombre effort rises understanding of lives stretched thin by duty and fear. Dim traces of those silent battles linger onward, hinting toward another burden waiting beyond the cold hours ahead. Steps inside the Tudor palace held weight far beyond the sound they made. Women walked through dim corridors, knowing that their presence influenced everything, yet remained recognized by almost no one. They learned to move quietly, to let their footsteps fade into the hum of court life, to keep their expressions still even when their thoughts churned. In daylight, they appeared like figures arranged for a ceremony, calm, composed, obedient. But in the shaded hours between obligations, their steps revealed truths that official histories ignored. A woman might pause before a doorway, listening for voices on the other side, adjusting her breath so it aligned with the silence. She understood instinctively when to enter, when to retreat, when to linger. Her timing could shift alliances without any spoken word. Yet no one credited her for the subtle influence she carried beneath her calm posture. Chronicles attributed outcomes to kings and counsellors, forgetting how often a woman's quiet presence guided the moment. As she moved down a long corridor lined with tapestries, her footsteps softened by woven rugs. She carried burdens no observer could guess. Each step reflected choices made for her, expectations she could not escape, sacrifices that carved themselves into her ribs. Still, she walked steadily, aware that the palace watched, even when it pretended not to. The walls themselves felt alive with scrutiny. A misstep, literal or figurative, could ruin her. Some women walked with their chins slightly lowered, shielding their eyes from curious glances. Others kept their gazes forward, steady and cold, using poise as armor. A few carried themselves with an elegance so precise it bordered on defiance. But every one of them understood the unspoken rule: remain visible, yet unnoticed, present, yet silent, essential, yet unacknowledged. In these corridors, whispers clung like mist. Servants murmured rumors as they passed, of the king's temper, of a nobleman's fall, of a queen's fading influence. Women absorbed these fragments, storing them quietly as survival tools. Knowledge became a currency they could not openly spend but desperately needed. A single overheard sentence could protect them for months or condemn them within hours. Some nights, when torches flickered low, a woman's steps echoed slightly louder, betraying tension she tried to hide. She might be returning from a summons she did not seek, or delivering news she did not wish to carry. Her shadow stretched ahead of her, elongated by dim light, reminding her how easily the palace could reduce her to a silhouette. Present, but without identity. In these same hallways, alliances formed in seconds. A glance exchanged between two women could signal warning, solidarity, or fear. One might slow her steps to allow another to pass safely before a group of watchful courtiers. Another might adjust her pace to avoid being cornered by someone with too much interest in her movements. Their unspoken coordination kept them alive, even as the court insisted they had no power. There were moments when a woman paused before a tall window, looking out at the courtyard below. Rain glazed the stones, blurring reflections of those who hurried across them. She saw her own faint outline in the glass, recognizable, yet somehow distant, as though she were watching a stranger mimic her life. These rare pauses allowed her a breath of something like honesty. But the breath ended quickly. Duty always called her back into motion. Walking became a language all its own. Some steps signaled submission, others resolved. Some concealed fear, others concealed desire. Court observers interpreted these movements with practiced eyes, though rarely with accuracy. They believed they understood the women who glided through those halls, yet misunderstood almost everything, because the most important truths remained hidden beneath layers of silence. In private moments, after the palace quieted, a woman might remove her shoes and rest her feet on cold stone, feeling the sting of fatigue. She rubbed her ankles where tight shoes left marks, tracing the faint bruises like memories. These tired feet had carried her through negotiations disguised as rituals, through dangers disguised as invitations, through survival disguised as obedience. No one thanked her. No one praised her. Her life unfolded quietly, yet shaped the court in ways no one acknowledged. Day after day, women crossed the same corridors, enduring the same scrutiny, performing the same roles. Yet each step contained multitudes: fear, calculation, restraint, and longing. They lived as shadows, yet created tremors that rippled across the monarchy. Their steps influenced marriages, treaties, scandals, and reconciliations. Their presence altered outcomes, even if history pretended otherwise. The palace never admitted how much it depended on these women who walked unseen. Chroniclers captured the footsteps of kings, not the footsteps of the women who steadied or redirected them. But anyone who listened closely, anyone who walked those halls with awareness, could sense the power humming beneath the quiet rhythm of these women's movements. Invisible motion within those long corridors reveals truth far detached from official record. Truth carried softly beneath surfaces, shaped by duty and silence. Within that muted cadence grows understanding of lives, steering power without recognition. Hushed traces remain there, hinting toward deeper shadows, tightening inside the stretches of stone, still waiting ahead. Homesickness inside the Tudor palace worked its way into women's lives slowly, like a chill that lingered even near a warm hearth. Many arrived from distant regions or distant countries, sent by families who saw marriage or court service as a path toward opportunity. The moment they crossed the palace threshold, a quiet truth settled inside them. They would not return. Their old lives, familiar landscapes, and childhood comforts remained behind as memories that grew both sharper and more painful with each passing year. The palace demanded loyalty, presence, and adaptation. Longing for another place felt almost like betrayal. Rainy afternoons intensified this ache. When skies turned grey and droplets tapped steadily on the window panes, a woman might sit at a wooden table near the narrow slit of a window, staring at a world blurred by mist. The sound reminded her of rooftops back home, of fields that soaked gently after storms, of a mother calling her inside to keep warm. These recollections arrived uninvited, soft but slicing. She let them settle for a moment before bringing out a piece of parchment, smoothing its surface with tender care. Writing became a bridge between past and present. A fragile one, but the only one she had. She dipped her quill into ink with a kind of reverence, as though touching a memory directly. Her words flowed slowly, describing things her mother would understand: the taste of morning bread in her homeland, the scent of rain on familiar soil, the pattern of light spilling through kitchen windows. She avoided mentioning sorrow outright, yet every line carried its weight. The palace was not unkind, but it was not home. It never could be. Some women wrote letters they had no intention of sending. The act itself comforted them. They folded their longing into sentences that allowed them, for a brief moment, to feel the warmth of connection. But sending such letters required permission, oversight, and trust, none of which came easily. The fear of words being intercepted lingered over them like a second shadow. A simple phrase of affection could be twisted into political implications. A reference to life before the palace could be misread as disloyalty, so the letters remained tucked away, hidden under garments or locked inside small wooden boxes. Festivals deepened their sense of displacement, while the palace celebrated with music, elaborate feasts, and bright colours. A woman felt a hollow ache pressing beneath her sternum. Celebrations reminded her of traditions she once knew, the songs her village sang during harvest, the lanterns lit along her childhood street, the meals shared with neighbours who felt like relatives. In the palace, celebration became a duty. She smiled because it was expected. She danced because it was required. But her heart drifted back to a place where joy had once lived without expectation. Standing among crowds of courtiers, she sometimes realized she had no one to reminisce with. No one shared her old songs, her mother's recipes, her childhood stories. She lived surrounded by people, yet existed profoundly alone. A maid might offer a gentle smile. Another noblewoman might listen as she described traditions from home. But those moments were fleeting. What she truly longed for, the feeling of belonging, could not be recreated inside stone walls built for power, not comfort. There were nights when the ache became almost physical. She lay awake on her mattress, staring at the ceiling beams as shadows shifted with candlelight. She wondered what her mother was doing at that moment, whether the fireside still crackled warmly, whether the family dog still slept near the doorway. whether anyone thought of her as she once was. Not as a court ornament or a political asset. Grief for a life continuing without her pressed heavily on her chest. The palace offered no mercy for such emotion. Duty left little space for longing. Women learned to swallow homesickness quietly, letting it settle in their bones. They carried it through their daily routines, through ceremonies, through audiences with the king. It shaped their steps, softened their voices, and deepened the shadows beneath their eyes. Some adapted over time, building new lives from necessity. Others never fully stopped grieving. Years passed. Seasons changed, and the garden paths grew familiar. Yet familiarity never became belonging. These women became both present and absent, rooted physically in the palace, spiritually tethered to a place they could no longer reach. Their identities existed in two worlds, neither fully claimed, neither fully relinquished. History rarely mentions this longing. It records political unions, diplomatic marriages, strategic placements, but not the quiet sorrow of women forced to trade their birthplaces for roles they never chose. It does not record how often they looked at the horizon from the palace courtyard, imagining roads leading home. But if one listens closely, the truth remains. Their hearts never stopped travelling. Their feet stayed within the palace, but their memories wandered. Their duties bound them, but their longing remained unashamedly alive. Unspoken yearning within those quiet hours reveals truth untouched by courtly ritual. Truth shaped by distance, no title could bridge. Within that gentle ache grows understanding of lives split between presence and memory. Lingering weight gathers there, hinting toward deeper shadows forming inside the stories waiting beyond this moment. Affection between women inside the Tudor palace grew in places untouched by ceremony, emerging quietly in the gaps left by duty, fear, and exhaustion. The court revolved around men. Men who commanded, judged, desired, and decided. Yet within this rigid world, some women found solace not in rebellion, but in each other. Their bond did not resemble romance as the world understood it, nor did it seek physical expression. It formed from shared breath in narrow chambers, from whispered comfort, from the kind of tenderness that expected nothing except presence. A woman might sit beside another during a late evening of sewing, their shoulders almost touching, their breaths falling into similar rhythms. The room felt cold, the day felt heavy, but somehow the closeness softened the air. They spoke quietly of tasks completed, of duties waiting tomorrow, of memories half forgotten. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Silence between them did not feel empty. It felt warm, like a blanket spread gently across their aching spirits. During long nights when fear crept through the palace, the fear of rumours, the fear of sickness, the fear of a king's shifting temper. One woman might reach out and touch another's hand. The gesture carried no hidden intent. It said simply, "I see your sorrow, and I am here." Their fingers laced for a moment, steadying both hearts. This small connection, fragile yet profound, gave them strength that sleep could not. Affection of this kind thrived in darkness, when torches burned low and footsteps faded into the distance. In the dimness, women could let their guards relax. They could lean slightly toward one another, share warmth beneath a blanket, or exchange glances that carried entire conversations. They found companionship in shared burdens and quiet understanding. Court life trained them to remain silent, but affection needed no voice, even in daylight. These bonds endured. A woman might adjust another's hairpin before a ceremony, smoothing her braid with a tenderness too subtle for others to notice. Another might tighten a sash around her friend's waist or press a handwritten note into her palm. Small gestures that held the softness the palace tried to extinguish. Their interactions, hidden beneath layers of protocol, became lifelines. Yet the danger surrounding these connections never loosened. The palace tolerated no affection that fell outside the acceptable narrative. Male desire was excused, even celebrated. Female attachment, however innocent, invited suspicion. Men, writing letters to each other, could claim diplomacy. Women sharing gentle companionship risked being branded unnatural, manipulative, or immoral. Servants whispered when two women lingered too long in a corridor. Courtiers watched closely when they walked side by side. A single moment of closeness, misinterpreted, could unravel lives. And so, while affection sustained them, fear shaped its edges. They kept distance in public, their faces composed, their steps deliberately measured. They learned to disguise tenderness as duty, helping with lace, carrying a shawl, adjusting a sleeve. Behind each gesture lay emotion too dangerous to reveal. Still, at night, when chambers dimmed and duties dissolved, they returned to one another. Some shared stories of homes left behind. Others spoke of men they were expected to marry, though their hearts felt no pull. Many simply rested their heads against each other's shoulders, drawing calm from the steady rise and fall of breath. These quiet acts did not violate rules, yet they tiptoed close enough to risk accusations in a world eager to condemn what it did not understand. They knew the consequences. Europe had burned women for less. Whispers alone sparked flames. The threat lay not in their affection, but in how easily men turned fear into punishment. Even innocent warmth between women could be twisted into deviance, treason, or witchcraft. So they loved carefully, not with passion, but with restraint, an ache shaped by caution. Their bond did not seek future or promise. It existed only in the present, deeply felt, yet intentionally temporary. They accepted that their lives would diverge. One married off to secure land, another sent to serve a different household, another dismissed without explanation. Each departure tore quietly at the heart, leaving behind hollow spaces no one else could see. But for the moments they shared, the world felt less sharp. These relationships rarely appear in records. History, written by men and guarded by institutions, did not consider tenderness between women significant. It ignored the deep companionship, forged between those who lived under the same roof, yet shared no freedom. But if one listens closely, traces of their affection remain, embedded in letters left unsigned, in garments embroidered side by side, in the faint warmth of footsteps that once matched pace in quiet halls. Affection between these women illuminated the palace in ways unseen by candlelight. It did not challenge the kingdom's structure, yet it quietly resisted its coldness. Their hands, clasped for a moment in darkness, carried more truth than any royal decree. They survived not because they were strong alone, but because they allowed themselves to be held by someone who understood their silent suffering. Quiet tenderness within those dim chambers reveals truth untouched by official memory. Truth shaped gently through shared endurance. Within that restrained longing grows understanding of lives bound closely in ways the palace never wished to see. Subdued warmth lingers there, hinting toward another fragile connection, forming somewhere deeper in the shadowed hours ahead. Touch inside the Tudor palace carried a weight far heavier than flesh meeting flesh. A single moment, a brush of fingers during a ceremony, the accidental meeting of hands while receiving a goblet, the brief contact of standing too close, could ignite a lifetime of scrutiny. Women moved through the court, knowing that their skin held consequences. What they did not say, what they did not choose, what they did not intend could still shape their fates. Silence never spared them. Interpretation always filled the gaps. A woman standing in the great hall during a royal wedding might feel someone's hand graze hers. It lasted less than a heartbeat, barely enough to register warmth. Certainly not enough to mean anything. Yet eyes watched. Roulement, always hungry, seized the gesture and reshaped it. Whispers travelled across the chamber, like sparks catching dry straw. By evening, that fleeting touch had turned into speculation, by morning into story, by dusk into accusation. She had done nothing except exist in the wrong place with the wrong witnesses. Because in the palace, women's bodies were not read with kindness. They were read like political maps. If their gaze lingered a fraction too long, observers imagined longing. If they looked away too quickly, others imagined guilt. If their cheeks flushed, whether from embarrassment, heat, or fear, it became a sign of hidden affection. Their faces betrayed them without their consent. Their gestures were interpreted before they could even understand them themselves. Men, meanwhile, walked freely through these narratives, largely untouched by consequence. A nobleman could look at a woman with interest, brush her shoulder as he passed, or lean too close during a conversation. Any impropriety fell upon her. Never him. The palace demanded she remain untouched, yet offered her no protection from the touch of others. It demanded she remain above suspicion, yet lived on suspicion of her. Friendships with other women suffered under this relentless gaze. Two women laughing softly during embroidery might be accused of gossiping about men. Two women holding hands while walking down a corridor might be accused of scheming, even offering comfort. A hand placed gently on a grieving shoulder could be twisted into emotional entanglement that threatened alliances. The palace did not understand nuance. It understood narrative, and narrative was often cruel. A woman could lose everything because someone else imagined a story about her. A single incident of accidental contact might cause her removal from a household, her betrothal to be cancelled, and her position to be downgraded. Families blamed her. Courtiers pitied her. Rumour hollowed her out until she became a shell, carrying the weight of a lie that no one bothered to correct. Defending herself only made her appear guilty. Silence made her seem resigned. No path led to safety. Inside her chamber, she might sit on the edge of her bed, replaying the moment again and again, searching for wrongdoing where none existed. She touched nothing, yet everything seemed touched by consequence. She spoke no words, yet words multiplied in the corridors without her. The palace turned her into an echo of a story she never lived. Her friend, once close, once trusted, might begin avoiding her, not out of cruelty, but fear. Affection became a risk neither could afford. Their conversations were shortened. Their shared glances vanished. Their comfort dissolved. A single rumour could destroy the fragile stability they fought to maintain. And they understood this too well. Loneliness seeped into the cracks where friendship once rested. Even years later, long after the incident had passed, the memory followed her. Courtiers remembered the story even after forgetting her name. Men recalled her involvement, even though she had never been involved. Women whispered warnings to younger girls. Avoid standing too near. Keep your gaze lowered. Step away, quickly. Remain untouchable. Her life became a lesson, one she never agreed to teach. In many ways, her body stopped belonging to her once. Others cast their interpretations upon it. That moment of accidental contact had been brief, harmless, almost forgettable. But the memory of it, reshaped by gossip, hardened by judgment, never faded. The palace preferred stories to truth, and so it kept the story alive long after she tried to bury it. Some women learned to navigate these dangers by constructing distance around their bodies. They kept their hands locked together during ceremonies. They stood with stiff posture, denying even the possibility of accidental touch. They positioned themselves between other ladies to avoid improper closeness with men. But such vigilance taxed them. It exhausted them. It drained their sense of self. A life lived in fear of interpretation left little space for being human. History later described these women as graceful and modest, and poised. It did not mention the tension in their shoulders, the calculations behind every movement, or the way they dreaded walking through crowded halls. It did not mention the gesture that ruined them, or the friendship that died because of a rumor, or the way they carried the memory of a touch that had never held meaning until others forced meaning into it. Lives shaped by silence often leave the deepest marks. These women, remembered only vaguely by record keepers, walked through a world that judged them for moments beyond their choosing. What touched them lasted forever, even if the touch itself had been nothing more than a passing brush in the chaos of court. Misread gestures within those narrow halls reveal truth far removed from innocent contact. Truth, shaped by fear of stories imposed upon them. Within that uneasy stillness grows understanding of lives bent beneath rumor's weight. Hidden tremors drift onward, hinting toward consequences, tightening inside hours, waiting just beyond this fragile moment. Burial inside the Tudor world often carried ceremony. Trumpets, prayers, and carefully recorded lineage. But when the child belonged to a woman whose grief held no political value, an infant stillborn, or one who lived only briefly, the ritual dissolved into silence. These small lives, precious only to their mothers, slipped out of the world without witnesses. The court demanded heirs. Not sorrow, it demanded composure, not mourning. And so the mothers learned to bury love quietly, lowering it into the cold ground before returning to the palaces that required their smiles. A woman might carry her newborn wrapped tightly in an old piece of cloth, its fabric softened by years of washing. She cradled it not as a royal symbol or political asset, but as a child, her child, whose chest no longer rose with breath. No priest waited to greet her. No attendants formed a procession. Only a maid, perhaps two, walked behind her with lowered heads, hands gathered in front of them as though they feared disturbing the air. Outside the palace walls, the earth felt harder, colder. The ground seldom welcomed small graves, but necessity forced the moment. A shallow spot was chosen beside an unused garden wall or near the edge of a forest path. The shovel's dull scrape broke the silence with a sound that made the mother's chest tighten. She knelt carefully, holding the small bundle as though even now her touch might protect it. Her throat burned with the urge to scream. She wanted the world to hear her, to acknowledge her loss, to feel even a fraction of the pain that shook her bones. But the palace allowed only quiet grief. Loud despair unsettled courtiers, made kings uncomfortable, and hinted at disorder. So she bit down on her lips until they trembled. Tears she could offer freely, cries she could not. The wind carried her quiet sobs away before they could echo. The burial lasted only moments. She placed the wrapped body into the shallow hole, arranging the cloth with trembling fingers. She touched its forehead through the fabric one last time, memorizing the shape she would never see again. Soil covered the small form with muted thuds that felt heavier than stone. When the grave disappeared beneath the final layer of earth, something inside her hollowed out, leaving a cavern grief could fill without limit. No marker was set, no name carved, no record kept. The palace preferred forgetting. A grave without a stone meant a story without permanence. Easy to hide, easy to erase, easy to pretend never existed. The mother understood this cruel truth. She whispered her child's name under her breath anyway, letting it live for a moment longer in the cold air before silence claimed it again. When she walked back toward the palace, her body felt heavier than her steps revealed. The weight sat inside her ribs, pressing inward. Her eyes burned, yet she wiped them dry long before anyone could see. A woman returning from grief needed to transform quickly. By the time she crossed the threshold, she must appear composed, presentably, and ready to resume her duties or perform her role beside the king. Sorrow became something she folded carefully, like a garment hidden beneath formal attire. The king, surrounded by advisors and concerns of state, might not ask about the child, or he might express brief condolences. A sentence, nothing more, before shifting attention to matters deemed more pressing. Her grief did not strengthen alliances, did not advance strategies, did not expand borders. It was a private wound in a world that valued only public consequence. Other women of the court recognized the emptiness behind her eyes. They had walked similar paths, carried similar losses, and buried children with similar silence. They offered comfort the only way they could, a lingering touch on the forearm, a steady glance that did not demand speech, a shared pause in a corridor. These gestures, fragile yet sincere, kept her from collapsing beneath the weight of what she could not voice. By the next feast, she would be expected to smile, softly, appropriately, gracefully, as though her heart had not broken open only days before. Courtiers complimented her gown, spoke of politics, and gossiped about alliances. She nodded, replied, and played her role with practiced ease. At moments, she felt her lips tremble, but she steadied them. The palace needed the illusion of harmony. Her sorrow had no place inside it. Late at night, after candle smoke drifted into darkness, she lay a hand across her abdomen, remembering the brief flutter of life that once moved there. She closed her eyes and saw the small grave, the cloth-wrapped form, the earth closing over it. She wondered whether the world would ever remember the child she loved. She knew the answer. Only she would. Only in silence. History rarely records mothers like her. Women who endured loss quietly, whose tears soaked into pillows rather than pages. Their children vanish from genealogies. Their grief dissolves into the margins. Their strength remains unnamed. Yet their silence shaped the emotional landscape of the palace more profoundly than any ceremony. They buried their children in the cold ground. Then they buried their grief beneath duty. And the world moved on. Hidden mourning within those dim hours reveals truth untouched by royal display. Truth shaped through loss, too small for record, yet immense for the heart. Within that muted return to duty grows understanding of lives carrying sorrow the court refused to see. Quiet weight settles there, hinting toward another shadow rising inside the stories, waiting beyond this stillness. Oblivion inside the Tudor world did not arrive suddenly. It settled slowly, like dust gathering on embroidered cloth left too long by a window. Women slipped into this fading, not because they failed, not because they lacked strength, but because their voices held no place inside the grand architecture of royal memory. Their lives unfolded in rooms without witnesses. Their gestures vanished before reaching any chronicler's ink, and their stories dissolved into silence long before anyone realized they were gone. A woman of the court might spend entire years shaping the atmosphere around her through presence alone. Her steps measured along stone floors, her hands steady during ceremonies, her posture perfected beside the queen. These moments appeared small, almost weightless, yet they formed the unseen fabric of palace life. But the chronicles, written by men with political objectives, recorded none of this. They captured battles, alliances, treaties, and executions. They did not describe the quiet endurance of women who held entire households together through discipline and grace. Inside her chamber, she embroidered scenes in thread so fine it could split beneath a fingernail. Each stitch carried hours of concentration, her breath slow, her back aching from the posture she maintained. She poured memory into patterns, flowers from her childhood garden, a river bend she used to walk beside, a bird whose song she recalled from distant winters. These images lived more vividly than any acknowledgement she received. Sometimes she pressed her cheek briefly against the fabric, feeling its coolness, wishing the world might look at it someday and see her there, hidden among threads. Portraits offered another fragile form of existence. A painter might arrive for a single season, brush poised, eyes observing her with detached precision. She sat perfectly still as he captured her posture, the fall of her hair, the curve of her collar, but he rarely asked for her name. He knew she would not be the subject of public admiration or political commemoration. When the painting was finished, it hung in a corridor where visitors passed without reading the small inscription beneath. Over generations, the inscription faded entirely. She became unknown lady. A face without lineage. Servants remembered her in subtle ways, the sound of her footsteps on mornings when she walked slightly faster, as though carrying urgency within her bones, the quiet tremble in her hands when she poured tea after receiving a troubling letter, the long pause she held at a window when watching snow fall. These memories remained intimate, fragile, impossible to preserve in writing. When those who witnessed her life died, these small recollections disappeared with them. During feasts, she moved with practiced calm, filling spaces no one acknowledged. Her smile carried restraint, shaped to satisfy courtly expectations without revealing emotion. She listened to courtiers laugh, gossip, and negotiate. Others sparkled beneath candlelight. Her presence flickered quietly behind them. She understood that failing to shine brightly was not a flaw, it was survival. Prominence invited danger. Blending into the background kept her safe. Yet blending also erased her. Letters could have preserved something. Her thoughts, her hopes, the parts of her heart no one else received. But letters were dangerous. Words committed to parchment could become evidence, leverage, or scandal, so she wrote rarely. And when she did, she burned the paper afterward. Ash carried her confessions into the air, leaving nothing behind. Her voice, again, dissolved. Even the queen, holding power above every woman in the kingdom, knew that history would remember her primarily through men, through her husband's decisions, through alliances made on her body's behalf, through children she might bear. Her personal griefs, her sleepless nights, her private victories, none of that would endure. She existed as an emblem, not a person. When illness spread through the court, women tended to the sick with steady hands. They wiped foreheads, changed linens, whispered reassurances into the ears of those drifting between fever and consciousness. They kept households functioning, while physicians debated humours and remedies. Yet once sickness passed, gratitude did not remain. Their labour vanished into the background like breath fading on cold glass. Years later, corridors remained familiar, while the individuals who walked them blurred into obscurity. New generations of nobles arrived, bringing different alliances, different tensions. Women who once held influence through quiet resilience watched their relevance slip away. Their names disappeared from conversations. Their faces blended into the collective memory of those who came before. It was great the 20 file. When death approached, it did so without ceremony for most of them. Their possessions, combs, rings, ribbons, and embroidery were distributed to servants or relatives. A few items were stored and forgotten in chests. Some were lost entirely. What remained was not a legacy, but the faint impression of a life traced only through its absence. History celebrates kings, chronicles wars, and records victories. It assigns weight to events that shift kingdoms and redraw borders. But the women who sustained those kingdoms from within, who endured without recognition, who carried private sorrows with unwavering discipline, they passed through the centuries as shadows on stone. They did not choose to be forgotten. They simply lived in a world that never considered remembering them. They moved through those chambers without ever holding the right to leave a mark behind. What lingers now are scraps of cloth, a blurred portrait, a silence too deep for records to hold. Something in that quiet wait invites you toward places where forgotten lives still press faintly against the stone. They moved through those long corridors with a steadiness that came from knowing no one would ever speak their names aloud. I remember watching them from a distance, their steps soft against the stone, their figures slipping from one doorway to the next, as if the palace itself preferred them blurred. They were the women who filled every space. Stepmothers brought in to mend alliances. Sisters-in-law folded quietly into households. Concubines who never stood in the light long enough to be noticed. Servants whose presence was required but never acknowledged. Each carried a role, yet none carried an identity that the court deemed worthy of preservation. Before dawn, they were the first to move. Candles burned low in their hands, small halos of flame trembling across the stone walls. Their work began long before the rest of the palace stirred. Some adjusted linens in chambers they would never sleep in. Some prepared water that would wash a queen's weary face. And some mended garments for ceremonies they themselves were not allowed to attend. Their breath fogged lightly in the cold air. And they worked without question, because questions were privileges for those with a voice. At meals, they lingered at the edges, neither seen nor unseen, simply present, like a shadow the mind learns to ignore. When they placed bread or poured wine, their eyes remained lowered, though occasionally I caught a flicker of thought moving behind the calm exterior. It was not ambition. Ambition would have been dangerous. It was something smaller, quieter. Perhaps the simple desire to be regarded as a person rather than a function. I learned to read their silences. Some silences carried fatigue, heavy and dull, pressed into their shoulders from years of lifting burdens that were never theirs. Others carried the tremor of fear, especially from those whose presence in the palace depended on the king's shifting temper or a nobleman's unstable favour. There were also silences of resignation, when a woman understood that no matter how much she endured, her life would conclude without a trace, folded into dust and forgotten by the very halls she tended. They rarely spoke to one another openly. The palace listened even when it seemed asleep. But at night, after the last torch dimmed, there were murmurs that travelled like low wind along the stone floors. Muted exchanges between women who shared nothing except a life bound by the same quiet erasure. They spoke of their families, of the villages they could not return to, of children they tended but did not bear, of mistakes they feared would follow them until their final breath. Their voices were soft, careful, but in those stolen moments, they were more human than the court ever allowed them to be. Sometimes I saw them gather near the old tapestries, the ones depicting queens, Visant, and mythical heroines. Their gazes lingered on the woven faces. Women who had names, stories, destiny, and something unspoken passed between them. Not envy. Not quite. It was a recognition of the chasm between being remembered and merely existing. A queen could be despised or adored, but she would be written. These women, though they bled, cried, loved, and suffered the same, would dissolve into time without leaving even a whisper. When illness swept through the court, they were the ones buried first. Records rarely noted them beyond a line or two. A maid passed. A companion expired. A serving woman succumbed. Their bodies were taken to the outskirts, placed in ground that never saw flowers. The court moved on immediately, its rhythm uninterrupted, as if each death were nothing more than the extinguishing of a candle. Spared no thought. I remember one woman especially, her movements so light they barely disturbed the air. Her face always half hidden behind a lock of dark hair. She served 3 queens in her lifetime, yet not one knew her name. When she died, the chamber grew colder. The queen asked for her replacement before noon. A new shadow appeared the next morning, wearing the same muted dress, stepping into the same unending anonymity. Their existence formed the undercurrent of the palace, steady and invisible. Without them, hallways would have been dirtier, garments torn, children unattended, tempers unchecked. Their labour held the entire structure together. Yet the structure refused even to acknowledge the hands that supported it. They were reminders that history is not crafted by fairness, but by visibility. And visibility, in the Tudor world, was a luxury reserved for those allowed to stand in the firelight. They drifted through time as quietly as the smoke rising from tallow lamps, present for an instant, then gone, leaving behind no scent, no trace, just a thin memory of movement. When I walked those passages years later, I still felt them, not ghosts. Exactly, more like the imprint of lives that wanted, just once, to be noticed. Their unseen presence filled every corridor, shaping a life the court never cared to recognize. What lingers from their silence draws attention toward the weight they carried without witness. A quiet pull edges closer to a truth hidden deeper within the hour that lies ahead. Death moved through the Tudor court without ceremony, and it touched women in ways the records never learned to hold. No music marked their final hours. No priests crowded around their beds. And no royal chronicler bothered to write a single line for the women who had spent their entire lives walking behind the men who shaped the kingdom. I watched the air in those rooms turn still whenever a woman's breath weakened, as if the palace itself understood how often a life could end without changing anything at all. There was no panic, no rush for help, only the quiet recognition that suffering was an old companion in these halls, and that its work here was nearly complete. Some deaths came from bleeding that could not be stopped, a red tide on linen sheets that women learned to fear from the moment they understood their bodies were meant for heirs. Others came from fever or the long collapse of lungs that had carried too many winters and too much candle smoke. Some deaths arrived quietly after a cup of wine, a bowl of broth, or a handful of herbs. Gifts given by hands that smiled too easily. In the court, poison was not a rumour. It was a form of punctuation used by those who wanted a problem to fade without sound. When these women died, their rooms were not filled with mourners. Instead, the curtains were drawn, the floors wiped clean, and their belongings gathered in silence. A gown is folded, a comb is placed in a small wooden box, a letter half finished, its ink dried in the shape of a breath that never returned. The court moved on before the body grew cold, because there was always another duty waiting, another audience, another mourning that required every trace of grief to be hidden beneath carefully arranged expressions. Their burials were the quietest acts of all. Carts carried their bodies away before sunrise, rolling toward churchyards far from the palace walls. The graves were shallow, the markers simple or absent. No marble, no carved names, not even a single flower left behind by someone who remembered. The earth closed over them quickly, as if eager to return what the court had never acknowledged. Birds made the only sounds, and even they did not stay long. What struck me most was how easily people forgot. A woman could serve the queen for years, hold her children, dress her wounds, aguard her secrets, and still vanish without leaving a trace, stronger than a rumour whispered once and then allowed to fade. Even noble women, those with titles and fine garments, disappeared into the soil with barely a note in the margins of a ledger. Their lives were measured by usefulness. Their deaths were measured by inconvenience. By the next feast day, their absence felt like a quiet change in the air, rather than a loss. There were nights when I walked the palace corridors and felt the weight of those who were no longer there. Empty stools by the fireside, a chair left slightly askew, a chamber door that no one touched now. Though it had once opened and closed a dozen times an hour, their presence lingered not through stories but through gaps. Silent spaces, shaped by the routines they once filled. People say the dead do not stay where they suffered. But in Tudor courts, I sensed that the women who left this world were held here by more than memory. They were held by everything they had endured without witness. The cruelty lay not only in how they died, but in how the world refused to remember they had lived. Pain left no entry in the archives. Devotion left no ink on the page. Even rebellion. Small, private, quiet, melted into the stone without leaving a scratch. And yet, when I stood near the gardens or the cold corners of the great hall, I sometimes felt the faint impression of footsteps, as though those women were still walking, still carrying burdens that had outlasted their bodies. Their stories were not lost, they were never written. That was the truth that settled heavily over everything. A woman could give her youth, her health, her blood, her final breath to the monarchy, and still the kingdom asked nothing of her except silence. In the end, the ground took what the palace would not claim, and history pretended there was nothing to see. Their final quiet passed through the court like a breath swallowed before a cry, leaving only the shape of absence behind. What remains invites a slow gaze toward the cost of being unseen. A deeper hush waits beyond this moment, drawing the mind toward what lies in the shadows yet to be understood. History often chooses the brightness it wishes to remember, and it prefers the kind that does not tremble. It admires crowns, procession, treaties, and victories, but it rarely lowers its gaze to the shadows at the edge of the story. Yet those shadows held lives that breathed, endured, and broke in silence. The Tudor women who walked those halls did not vanish because they were unimportant. They vanished because no one bothered to light a candle toward the corners where they stood. When I think of them now, I do not see the paintings the world has preserved. I see the moments the palace forgot, moments that still cling to the stones like cold breath on winter glass. At night, the palace seemed almost honest. The torches were out, the steps were fewer, and the long corridors no longer pretended to be grand. In that softened darkness, the truth of the women became easier to feel. They were not figures of elegance or symbols of dynastic purpose. They were simply people trying to survive the weight laid upon them. Some pressed their hands to their ribs as if steadying a fear they could never name aloud. Others walked with measured calm, even though their hearts beat in a rhythm shaped by uncertainty, expectation, and wounds hidden beneath fabric and silence. I often sensed how tired they were, not the kind of tiredness that comes from physical labor, but the slow erosion of a life lived under constant watch. They were expected to smile without letting their eyes betray pain. They were expected to speak only when permitted, and remain silent even when the truth pressed hard against their teeth. They learned to mask longing, grief, anger, and disappointment as if each were a small, disobedient flame that might burn the fragile order of the court. The palace demanded beauty, obedience, and restraint, but gave nothing back except the faint promise of safety, a promise that failed more often than it held. Some women had lost children and were told not to weep. Women who had lost themselves and were told to keep walking. Women who carried secrets too heavy for their frames. Yet they whispered reassurance to the very people who had placed those burdens upon them. Their gestures were quiet, gentle, unrecorded. A hand on a servant's shoulder. A moment spent braiding a young girl's hair. A small breath of relief when the door closed behind them after a long day. These were the pieces of their existence that history never valued, though they made up the substance of who they were. Sometimes I imagined their stories rising from the stone floors when the moon was high, the way mist rises from a river at dawn, not as voices, but as impressions, soft outlines of memory shaped by footsteps, by tears absorbed into linen, by hopes whispered into pillows. The palace walls held everything the archives rejected. They remembered a queen who prayed for a child she would never bear. They remembered a lady in waiting who hid her trembling hands inside oversized sleeves. They remembered a girl who came from a distant village and died before the king ever learned her name. These fragments do not belong to official histories, yet they are truer than many of the events scholars argue over. When I stood at the edge of the Great Hall after midnight, I could almost feel the echo of how those women navigated the world. They moved carefully, always aware that a misstep could become a rumor could become a suspicion, and a suspicion could become a death sentence. Their survival depended on reading every shift in a man's expression, anticipating every change in mood, and adjusting their own behavior before danger even arrived. They lived in a landscape shaped by others' desires, where their own emotions were luxuries they could not afford. But there were also moments when they allowed themselves small acts of rebellion, tiny defiance carried out in private, a forbidden letter burned before dawn, a piece of cloth embroidered with a symbol no one else would understand. A tear was wiped away before anyone noticed. These gestures seem small to us now, but in their time, they were declarations of selfhood, fragile but real. They were proof that even under layers of expectation and oppression, something within them refused to die. As the years turned, many of these women faded from memory. Their names slipped from the tongues of those who once depended on them. Their portraits, when painted at all, were tucked away in corners or mislabeled until no one knew who had once stood for the artist. Their graves lay unnoticed, their belongings passed to others without acknowledgement. Yet the palace itself, its stones, its tapestries, its corridors, kept the imprint of their presence. Buildings remember better than people, and the Tudor Court was no exception. What remains now is a sensation more than a story, a faint pressure in the air where a life once stood, a quiet sense that someone walked the same path long before you did, carrying burdens you will never fully comprehend. If you close your eyes, it is possible to feel the softness of their breath, the weight of their sorrow, the courage that lived and died in the confines of those gilded rooms. Their existence was not loud, but it was enduring, and it shaped the world in ways the chronicles refuse to confess. It is said that history soothes those who prefer comfort over truth, and perhaps that is why the brightest chapters are the ones most often retold. But beneath the glow, the darker stories continue to breathe. The women of the Tudor court were not shadows, they were the quiet pulse beneath the throne, the unseen scaffold holding together a kingdom that rarely thanked them. Their tears watered the roots of dynasties, and their silence kept the court from collapsing under its own weight. When I think of them tonight, I imagine them not as forgotten figures, but as a slow tide rising through centuries of neglect. Their stories do not vanish simply because they were not written. They live in every woman who ever felt unheard, in every soul who ever carried sorrow in places no one chose to look. Their memory lingers in the hush of night, in the cold shimmer of stone, in the fragile certainty that even the quietest lives matter. So rest gently now, wherever you are, as the whispers of those lives drift through the dark. Let their endurance settle beside you like a veil of cool air, neither frightening nor loud, just present, steady, and real. Allow the quiet weight of their stories to cradle your thoughts as the world softens around you. And if your eyes grow heavy, trust that their footsteps will keep walking through the halls of history, unseen but unwavering, carrying truths that refuse to die. May your night be calm, and may your dreams walk softly among those forgotten women who still breathe in the spaces the world overlooked. Sleep well beneath their silent watch, and drift into rest, knowing that even the smallest, quietest life leaves a trace no darkness can erase.